Uh, as Asif said, today we're going to be talking about planning a migration to Office 365. Before we get started, though, I just wanted to mention a couple of things about the presentation. I am going to do just a very brief introduction and background about myself, and then I do have some slides to cover some material, but we're also going to do a little bit of getting our hands dirty and going into the admin portal on Office 365 just to see a little bit about what we're actually going to be planning for. So that'll be part of it as well. I will be taking questions about halfway through. I will stop and answer a few questions. If so, feel free to post them in the question section of your screen, and I will look at that partway through the webinar and answer some questions. And then I will also stop and answer some questions toward the end as well. All right, so let's get started. This is me. If you haven't met me, that's actually me in the picture, and that was a professional photographer and good lighting at a very favorable angle. So if you ever meet me in person, you may be a little disappointed. I am based out of Chicago, as Asif said. I'm a SharePoint and Office 365 solution architect and an evangelist for SPR Consulting. I have a little bit of contact information on the page. So feel free to contact me if you have questions about anything that comes up during the webinar and you aren't able to get them answered during the webinar. So the way this is organized is we're actually going to go through a variety of different high-level topics discussing the roadmap of getting you from point A to point B. How do I get from where I am today to a fully implemented Office 365 environment? And I've organized it into a few different sections, and each of the sections will have some subtopics that we'll go through in detail. The first section is about setting up your production Office 365 tenant. We're going to talk a little bit about how to select your licensing model, how to designate your tenant name, and then setting up custom domains. So just so you're aware, some of this presentation will be a little bit technical, but a lot of it is more geared towards planning and high level. So hopefully there'll be enough for everybody to be able to understand and follow along. So the first thing to consider when you're moving to Office 365 is your licensing model and how you're going to essentially pay for it. One of the nice things about the cloud, moving to the cloud and the cloud environments, is it normalizes the costs associated with running IT and IT infrastructure and all the software associated with it. And what I mean by that is that instead of having a bunch of servers and networking infrastructure and people to pay, in those cases, it's sometimes very difficult to figure out what your true costs are. In the case of a cloud model, however, the way the licensing models work is you pay a fixed fee per user per month. And you can see in the screen here, just in these three licensing models that I've got listed there, it's $8.25 per user per month, and then $12.50 and $5. The one on the left, all three of these are part of the business licensing model, which applies to organizations that have users that have up to 300 users. So they're for fairly small organizations. The first licensing model, the Office 365 Business one, includes Office applications, all your normal Office applications, and then some storage online in OneDrive. The second one in the middle is a little bit of an upgrade from that in that it includes additional services like Exchange, SharePoint, Skype for Business, Teams, and Yammer. And then the third one includes just the cloud services and not the actual Office applications. So as you're thinking about moving to Office 365, you have to evaluate what you're actually going to buy, what services you're going to buy, and it's not. And one of the nice and sometimes a little bit confusing things is there's a lot of different options. So even though I'm showing you several different licensing models for the business and business premium, add-ons are available for each of the different services separately as well too. For larger organizations, they've got the enterprise licensing models. So there's the E1, the E3, and the E5. So included in the E1 is email, file sharing with OneDrive up to 1 terabyte, all the Office Online products, and then team sites and a few other things. You'll notice, though, that it doesn't include the desktop versions of Microsoft Office. So with the E1 license, you're only using Microsoft Office Online. So you're using Word through the browser, Excel through the browser, and so on. With the Office 365 Enterprise license, you get all the Office desktop products in addition to the cloud products like Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, Skype, and Yammer. And E3 is honestly the one that I most commonly see organizations purchasing as a starting point. It includes all of the basic services that they need to operate their business on an ongoing basis. The E5 license includes some additional features, including the ability to dial into Skype from an outside line using a conference dial-in. It also includes a Power BI license and some advanced data governance and security features. Some of the organizations that are more concerned about Power BI and reporting, as well as advanced security features, purchase E5 licenses. Okay. And as I mentioned, one of the important things to keep in mind throughout this is that even though there are some basic licensing models included here, you can purchase a lot of the additional services as add-ons. For example, the Power BI is included in the E5, but if you had an E3 license, you could purchase Power BI separately just for a few people and add it on to their E3 license. And that's true of pretty much all of the services included in the E5 license that are not included in the E3 license. In addition to that, there's also government licensing models that sort of mirror the enterprise licensing models as well, that are geared towards government organizations. The next thing to think about is designating your tenant name. And I'm going to highlight this, and you'll see why in just a minute. But the basic premise is that when you create your tenant in Office 365, you have to give it a name. So the tenant name that you give it will become the name, and then there'll be a period on Microsoft.com. So tenant name in this example is what you're going to call your tenant. So a lot of times it might be your organization name or some acronym from your organization that represents your organization. But there's a few things to keep in mind. The tenant name has to be unique across all organizations. And when I say all organizations, I mean no one else in all of Office 365 could have used that name. For example, I'm pretty sure that the tenant name of Microsoft is taken right now. I probably couldn't go out there and just do Microsoft on Microsoft.com. The other thing to keep in mind is that the tenant name is used in SharePoint Online as well as OneDrive. So when your users are accessing SharePoint Online, it'll be tenantname.sharepoint.com. So if your organization is Microsoft and your tenant name is Microsoft, then it would be microsoft.sharepoint.com. And then OneDrive is similar, and then it's your tenant name -my.sharepoint.com. The key thing about this is that once you set it up, you cannot change it. And there is a user voice post, and this, just for those of you that aren't familiar, user voice is a way to provide feedback to Microsoft and request additional features. There's a user voice post that has been out there for a couple of years now at least, and has, I think, tens of thousands of requests that they be allowed to change that tenant name, and so far it's still sitting out there. I don't know that that's ever going to happen. I do know of at least one instance where for a very large organization, large customer, Microsoft did change the tenant name, but essentially what they did is they moved the entire tenant to a new tenant. So they didn't actually change the name, they just moved everything. So the trick here is that when you're setting up a tenant and you're thinking as an organization, well, we just like to try out Office 365, let's call our tenant, ABC Organization Dev. Or test, ABC test. A lot of times what happens is that people start putting data into the test tenant, and suddenly it becomes production. So you have to think through that in advance. The other thing I often see is organizations that go through mergers and acquisitions a lot of times, and their name changes or rebranding. You have to consider that whatever your tenant name is going to be, it's going to be there forever. So you want it to be something that represents your organization, but is also generic enough to survive any changes over time. The next thing you have to do is set up custom domains. So if you have some custom domains, you want to think about what you're going to be moving to Office 365. So when I'm talking about custom domains, this would be, in my case, I use my domain is dougheminger.com. So that's my domain on my Office 365 tenant. You can have up to 900 domains. You just want to think about what you're going to put on Office 365 and use for emails for various groups within your organization, as well as other things within your organization. But keep in mind, as I mentioned, that the SharePoint site and the OneDrive site are based on your tenant name, not your custom domains. All right, so let's talk about evaluating features. In this section, we're gonna figure out how you evaluate features and decide which ones should be enabled, and then the important process of establishing roles and responsibilities for administration and data ownership. So when you're evaluating features, obviously, or a lot of times organizations, the first one they look at is mail. I've done several or dozens of Office 365 implementations and migrations, and in every single case, mail was the first thing to be set up and implemented in Office 365. That's not to say that it always has to be the first one, or should, but you should consider it, because mail is sort of the simple one to set up, and it's very tightly integrated to some of the other features on Office 365. So if you're going to do an Office 365 implementation, the first thing you should look at rolling out is mail. So Outlook and Exchange Online. It's also tightly integrated with identities. So when you set up Office 365, you want to make sure to set up your identities appropriately, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but this involves creating user accounts, setting passwords, all that stuff. A lot of times your login for Office 365 is your email account, so that's how people sort of remember it, and it's an easy way to remember your user ID when you log in. So mail is a good place to start for implementing Office 365. But from there, it's sort of up in the air as to how you want to implement things. There are a lot of productivity features that you can implement sort of on an as-needed or an ad hoc basis. You can implement, obviously, all of the desktop Office applications, including Word, Excel, PowerPoint, if you haven't already. But there are some differences when you implement them from Office 365 licensing versus a rollout from an on-premises rollout. There's also Flow and Power Apps for workflow and forms and business processes. Are you going to start using those? Do you have existing workflows? How are you going to use those going forward? In addition, there's some additional productivity apps like Planner and Sway that you may want to implement or train your users on how to use. A lot of organizations that I work with, if they're rolling out Office 365 for the very first time, they take sort of a staged approach. We're going to start with mail and leave everything else turned off to begin with, and then slowly roll out additional features as we're able to get users able to understand and use those features. So, for example, we might incrementally roll out Office apps, and then train people on how to use Power Apps or maybe Planner and OneNote and things like that, and then continuously roll those things out. The next would be the collaboration tools. So SharePoint, Delve, Teams, and Yammer. All of those things are also features within Office 365 that you want to think about how to roll those out. And I'll talk a little bit later about how you may want to stage those as well. And then there's the content section, so OneDrive, and then the video portal as well. And lastly, Skype for messaging. So as an organization, you have to figure out what you're going to roll out, and then when you're going to roll it out, and how you're going to train your users on using it. And one of the things that initially I suggest that organizations do when they're going into an Office 365 implementation is they do a sort of an application mapping. So you look at what in the organization you're using today, what applications you're using, and how you're using them. And then you map them to existing Office 365 applications and identify any gaps. And then you build a plan to move from the existing applications to the Office 365 applications over time or as a staged migration. And as part of that process, you would evaluate the features and turn them on or off appropriately. So this is what the features sort of looks like from the admin portal. They can be turned off, controlled through licensing, like Teams, Sway, SharePoint, and Exchange, and other ones are controlled through PowerShell in different settings. So I'm actually just going to show you what this looks like. I've actually got right here, this is the, I'm just going to go back to home here to make this simpler. This is the admin center in Office 365. So the administrators of the entire environment would have access to this section of Office 365 and be able to control the settings and configuration for your tenant. If I want to look at the features for a particular user, I can go into the users section here and click on active users. And right now I am the only active user in this tenant. But if I click on my name, it's going to bring up some information about me and how it's applied to this organization. So for example, you can see there's my username and email. I don't have any aliases, but then I've got a product license assigned to me. And you can see this is the Office 365 Enterprise E3 product license that we discussed. And I'm going to actually click on edit here. And you'll see when I click on edit, it shows me all of the different features that are part of this product license. So I've got a bunch of different things here, and then I can control whether I want to turn those on or off through the licensing section. So for example, if I don't want Microsoft Teams turned on for me, I can just turn it off right here. In some cases, there are other ways to do it besides just licensing, but for some of the features, this is an effective way to control whether it's turned on or off. So as you can see, you can do this at the individual level, but you can also do it for everybody the same way at an organizational level. So as you're rolling out Office 365 and thinking about what features you're going to implement, it's pretty simple to control what features are turned on or off from day one, and then going forward, turn them on as you need them or as you roll them out. All right. The other thing that's really important in these early stages is to establish administrative responsibilities for the environment. This is beginning to start your governance process. So one of the first people or groups of people that you'll want to identify are the global administrators, also called the company administrators. They have access to all administrative aspects of the Office 365 suite in your tenant. So they are the overall, they have control over everything. But then there's also sort of this subset of other administrators that you'll want to partition out different duties and responsibilities to. So for the billing administrator, for example, they make purchases, manage support tickets, and monitor service health. The user admin, for example, resets passwords. It can also add and delete users and also manage service health. The password admin is restricted to just resetting passwords for users. So as you think about how as you think about how this applies to your organization, some organizations have service centers where they may apply groups of people to have the password admin role where they can reset passwords, while others may have user admin roles. And then the service admin opens support requests with Microsoft. They can view the service dashboard, and there's a message center that Microsoft communicates with the admins through to let them know about new features coming out and changes to the service, the overall Office 365 service. There's also separately several administrators related to the different features. So there's a SharePoint admin that can be assigned, as well as Power BI, Skype, and Exchange. And you'll want to identify those people early on in the process so they can take ownership of their administration responsibilities as the site is being built and rolled out. And then, of course, within the SharePoint admin, there are the traditional roles, and I obviously don't list them all out here, but there are the site collection admins, the site owners, and the power users. all who play an important role in the SharePoint rollout. And again, you'll want to identify these people early on in the process um, of, of implementing your Office 365. All right. So the next section, I'm going to talk about information protection. Actually, I noticed that there's a question here, and it might be a good time to stop and ask, answer a question. Sanjay asked the question, are all the items in the admin center controlled exclusively tenant-wide, or can some be activated on a group-by-group basis? Definitely some of the items in the admin center can be activated on a group-by-group basis. It depends on the setting, though. Not all of them can. So it's sort of a case-by-case discussion. We're actually going to talk a little bit later about external sharing, and I'll explain it a little bit later in more detail, but basically it's the ability to share documents and items outside the organization. That can be controlled on a group-by-group basis, but also some of the features can be controlled that way as well. All right, thanks for your question. Feel free to add more questions, guys, if you have any more. So we're going to step into information protection, and this is also an important part of planning your Office 365 implementation, is setting up how to protect access to the environment, how to control and prevent leaks and potential threats. You also want to think about how to secure the admin access, and of course consider governance and retention policies as well, and we'll go through all that. So one of the things you want to do when you first roll out Office 365 is you want to disable identities that are no longer active. And this says in Azure Active Directory, but it could be in your on-premises Active Directory as well. Generally, the process for getting your identities up to Office 365 is to synchronize them from your on-premises Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. But before you do that, you should really identify any identities that are no longer active. You can check for inactive users and disable those accounts. This saves on licensing and helps reduce any potential threats for the surface area of your environment. You also want to enable self-service password reset in Azure Active Directory. Actually, this says Azure Active Directory, but you want to evaluate the password reset policy for your organization as a whole. In the on-premises environment, normally users would press Control-Alt-Delete in a Microsoft environment and change their password through Active Directory just by hitting the Change Password button and changing it there. That may continue to be the case in the Office 365 environment, but you may want to evaluate that based on how you're synchronizing identities. And there is another option. You can also turn on the ability to give users the capability to do a self-service password reset in Office 365 and Azure Active Directory. It does require some additional premium licensing, but it's a nice feature for users that want to be able to just go to the cloud and update their password and not have to do it from their laptop. Maybe they can do it from their phone or from another device if you've allowed that capability. And I'm sort of glossing over a big item here. Intune is an important thing to consider. Intune is a product that Microsoft uses with Azure and Office 365 to protect data on mobile devices and desktop computers. What it does is, if you want to use, for example, the Exchange or the Outlook app on your iPhone, or maybe SharePoint on your iPhone or OneDrive on your iPhone, your company can enforce policies through Intune on your phone. So when you try to connect to your Outlook or email from your phone, Intune will prompt you to install some software that will then enforce policies. An example of one of those policies is maybe your organization will want you to have a more secure PIN. So instead of 4 digits, you have to have 6 digits. So that's an example of a policy that Intune can enforce on the phone or the mobile device as part of being able to access your email or your files or whatever. So evaluating the Intune product and what you want users to be able to do on their mobile devices and what security measures you want to have in place for that is extremely important and should be considered early on in the planning phases. Another important one is configuring multi-factor authentication. Initially, when I was doing cloud Office 365 and cloud rollouts, not a lot of organizations use this right off the bat, but Microsoft has made it pretty seamless and easy to include this as part of your licensing in E3. So it's included in E3 licensing to set up multi-factor authentication for every user if you want. So I'm actually just going to show you what that looks like. I have a screenshot here, but I'll just show you. So I'm back in my admin center here, and this is me again. I'm still on the same user. I'm going to cancel out of the features here, and at the bottom there is a section called Manage Multi-Factor Authentication. So I'm going to click on that. And for those of you that aren't aware, multi-factor authentication forces you, once you sign in with your normal user ID and password, to receive a text or a phone call or something like that to confirm that it really is you. So these are the users in the organization and whether multi-factor authentication is enabled or disabled. You can see that for me it is disabled. I'm going to click on service settings here just to show you what they look like. So what this does is this allows you to set up the multi-factor authentication service for your organization as a whole, and you can allow certain methods for users to use as their second factor. So they can allow call to phone, text to phone, or a notification through a mobile app, or a verification code from a mobile app. They're all available in this particular tenant because I've got them all checked. But you'll want to evaluate which ones are appropriate for you. In the case of the mobile app, you can use the Microsoft mobile app and just install it on your phone and use that to as your second factor authentication. I actually use that quite a bit with different tenants. And then once you've set it up for your organization and determined what factors you're going to allow, then you can determine who should have multi-factor authentication. So as an organization, you need to decide, are you going to require MFA for everyone or just certain groups of people or no one? And I've run across all situations. So some organizations don't require it for anyone. Some organizations require it for everyone. But at a minimum, I strongly recommend that you at least require it for your global administrators and your main administrators. And it's pretty easy to set it up to do that. You can set your view to just global administrators, for example, and maybe you've got like 5 or 6 of them. They would all appear here, and then you would just check the box. And all you would do is click Enable. And once you click Enable, the user will be notified the next time they have to log in that they have to set up MFA, and it actually walks them through the process of setting up that second factor authentication. It's pretty straightforward. All right. So let's move on to collaboration and preventing leaks. So one of the things that you're also going to want to think about is all the permissions that you're going to assign. If you're carrying over an environment from an existing on-premises environment, a lot of times you can carry over the permissions the same way. But if you're building something new, you'll want to think through how you're applying those permissions, both for SharePoint, OneDrive, and other business libraries. The other thing you want to think about, and I mentioned this earlier, is you'll want to think about how to configure your external sharing policies to support your objectives. And let me just show you what that looks like as well. So I'm going to go back to my admin portal here. But instead of this time going to the users, I'm going to scroll down. There's a section down here called admin centers where I can go to the various admin centers for the different features. So in this particular case, I'm just going to demonstrate the SharePoint external sharing. So I'm going to click on SharePoint. And you'll notice that this looks somewhat similar to the old central admin from on-premises. But it's got a few different things. One of the different things is the sharing section right here. So the sharing settings can be applied at different levels. In other words, in SharePoint, they can be applied globally across all of SharePoint, or they can be applied at a site-by-site level. But what this does is it allows you as an administrator and as an organization to decide what you're going to allow your users to share outside of your organization. So at the most restrictive level, I could say, I'm not going to allow them to share any kind of documents, files, or anything outside of my organization. And what that means is that anyone without a login to my tenant won't be able to get a document or a file unless they download it and email it, but there's no sharing directly from the tenant. The next setting is I can allow sharing only with external users that already exist in the organization's directory. So if I have a login to the tenant, but I'm not an actual user at the company, I can be shared. I can have a document shared with me. And then the third one is I can have the document shared with me as long as I have a login at all to any tenant. So as long as I have an Office 365 login, I can get a document shared with me. And then the last, least restrictive one is I can share a document with anyone, including anonymous users who don't have a login. So obviously this is an important security setting, and it doesn't apply just to SharePoint, it applies to OneDrive as well. Anywhere where you have files, there are different settings for each. And as you can see, there's a few nuances to the setting that I'm not going to go through here. But you'll want to think through as an organization how you're going to want to allow your users to share documents externally. And part of the reason I'm going through this is because we didn't have this decision on premises, right? I mean, it was just sharing or no sharing. So I had a request to zoom in, so I'm zooming in a little bit. Sorry if it's a little bit late. All right. The other thing you're going to start to think about is device access and policies for SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, including conditional access and network location policies. You can actually set up access policies such that you can only access it from SharePoint and OneDrive for Business from certain IP addresses or certain locations. So if your organization requires that, you can certainly configure that as well. And data loss prevention is an important thing to think through. This is another one where in SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, and certainly within the file system, this didn't really exist prior to Office 365 unless you purchased a third-party tool. And some organizations did do that. They purchased third-party tools to manage their data loss prevention and keep that under control. But as we move to the cloud, this feature became available, and we have to think through like how we as an organization can leverage this to make sure that data is not leaking from our cloud environment against our wishes. So data loss prevention is a nice feature in Office 365. I'm not going to go through the nuances of it. It can be a little bit complex, but I just want to point out that as an evolving feature on Office 365, it's an important thing to consider as you're moving there. Another nice feature is using labels to implement classification-based retention and protection policies. Office 365 labels came out last year, I believe, and the default capabilities allow you to set retention policies against those labels. But if you have Azure Information Protection, which is an elevated license level under E5, I believe. Then you can apply other policies as well. I'm actually going to show you a little bit about that in just a minute. So as part of your retention policies, you want to consider what retention policies you have and apply those across the board to the important places on Office 365. It helps reduce your risk in the event of litigation or a security breach. And again, this is another thing that didn't really exist in on-premises environments unless you purchased a third-party tool. So I'm going to show you what this looks like as well. And in this case, I'm actually going to go to, under the Admin Center, there's a section called Security and Compliance. Microsoft is moving a lot of the things related to retention and security and all that stuff, data loss prevention, is all under the Security and Compliance umbrella in the Admin Center. Whereas it used to be under some of the different sections like Exchange and SharePoint and so on. Anyway, under Data Governance, there's a section called Retention. And there's some policies here that I've already created and applied, but I'm just going to walk you through creating a policy just so you can get a feel for what it actually is and does. So if I click Create here, I'll just call this the green policy and click Next. It's going to ask me how long I want to retain content, and I can choose forever, or I can specify a certain time period, and the time period can be in years, months, or days. So I'm going to say 2 years, and I'm going to say based on when it was created, but I could also say based on when it was modified. And then what do I want to do with it at the end of 2 years? I want to delete it. So I'm going to say delete it. And there are some advanced settings related to this, and just to show you what this includes, I can actually scan the content to look for specific words or phrases and then retain it based on that. Or I can scan it based on sensitive information that's part of the DLP program. So in other words, I could look for social security numbers or HIPAA data, things like that, or other account information and retain it based on that. But I'm just going to select the basic retention policy, click Next. And then the nice thing is it allows me to choose what locations I want to apply this retention policy to. So I can apply it to Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Groups, Skype for Business, and public folders. I can apply it to all of them, I can apply it to none of them, and even within some of them, I can select certain targeted groups or recipients. So for Exchange, I could apply it to certain people, and for SharePoint, I could apply it to certain sites, and so on. So if I wanted to just apply this to Exchange, for example, I would just uncheck these and click Next. And now it's going to ask me if I want to turn on preservation lock, which basically means once this policy is created, it can't be deleted, just to prevent someone from changing it and getting rid of the policy. So I'm going to skip that. And then it reviews my settings with me and tells me that it's going to take a day or so to apply the retention policy to my location. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create. So in this case, I just created a retention policy that said, anything that was created more than 2 years ago in Exchange should be deleted. So the retention policy applies to anything that should be deleted, or anything in Exchange over 2 years. It's pretty easy to do. You can see I did it in under a minute or so, and you can do that. You can set these retention policies to a variety of different settings based on your organization's needs. So in your planning stages, you should figure out what your retention policy should be for the different types of data that you're maintaining. There are a number of threat protection capabilities built into the E5 licensing and also available as add-ons to the E3 license. So one example is advanced threat protection for Exchange Online, which helps protect against malicious threats, including like links, unsafe attachments, malware campaigns, things like that. A lot of that stuff You can build some rules that do that in Exchange Online today, but this is much more advanced than that. For example, if a user gets a malicious or virus infected email with an attachment with a virus in it, Microsoft will basically quarantine that email they'll spin up a virtual machine, put the email on the virtual machine, and then open it and see what happens, all within the span of like seconds or minutes of receiving the email. And you won't even ever know that anything happened, except the administrators will get a report saying that this email was sent with the virus. It was determined that this particular virus was detected once it was opened, and it was quarantined accordingly. And then the administrators will be able to take action as needed. So this advanced threat protection is pretty sophisticated stuff. It's applied across all tenants and users who have advanced protection. So they're leveraging knowledge gained and artificial intelligence gained for everyone. It's not just one organization trying to protect themselves. It's Microsoft doing it for everyone. There's also advanced security management, which allows deeper visibility into how access is granted, more controls over things, improved protection for cloud applications, etc. But again, this is also an E5 option. There are a number of things that you need to do to stay compliant as well. E-discovery was another thing in the on-premises environment that was pretty much non-existent. In the Microsoft world, you had to buy a third-party product. But in Office 365, they've rolled out e-discovery capabilities that are still, not the greatest, but very, very helpful and much improved over nothing. So, but one of the things you'll want to do when you're planning and moving to Office 365 is meet with your legal department and say, hey, we have e-discovery capabilities in Office 365 for Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. Who's going to be the e-discovery manager, who's going to be the compliance manager, and have the ability to make a case and put things on legal hold, so that they can't be deleted or changed once they're part of a case. So as part of the planning phase, you need to figure out how you're going to conduct e-discovery in Office 365 and who's going to be involved with that. Another thing is you want to make sure to figure out how you're going to audit user and administrator actions for compliance. There is sophisticated and comprehensive logging that you can turn on in Office 365, but you actually have to set up a process for monitoring that logging on a periodic basis. I would recommend at least monthly or quarterly reviewing the audit logs for administrator actions taken. So you want some checks and balances in place for the global administrators to make sure they're not inappropriately removing information or giving themselves privileges that they shouldn't, things like that. You can also apply a number of different security restrictions in Exchange, including SMIME encryption, PKI, a number of other different encryption or signature technology, certificate and signature technologies to protect those emails. So you'll want to evaluate that as well and make sure that you're thinking of that in Exchange Online. And as I mentioned, you'll also want to apply the retention policies. Okay, so secure the privileged accounts. That goes without saying. I mentioned that you want to make sure that they have MFA if possible. You also want to make sure that you have some separation of duties between the different roles. So your SharePoint administrator is not also your Exchange administrator, and so on. And then you also, as I mentioned, want to review the audit logs for administrator activities to make sure that nobody's abusing that. The other thing I think a lot of people forget about, at least initially, is how to validate your network infrastructure. So we're going to go through that really quickly. You want to make sure that you have secure internet or sufficient internet capacity for each of your buildings or locations, and you want to consider maybe getting redundant network links because you're going to be using the internet a lot more with Office 365 than you did before. And I love this statement this is from Microsoft, so I'm just going to read this real quick. It says, Office 365 is a secure, reliable, high-performance service that runs over the public internet. Microsoft continues to invest to enhance these aspects of the service. All Office 365 services are available via internet connectivity. I will read between the lines for you. What they're saying is that we are awesome at optimizing our network. It's not us, it's you. So if you hit a slow page, it's not us. That's basically what they're saying there. So it's either the internet or it's your environment. So obviously we can't really control what's going on the internet, but the reality is they're actually probably right. In most cases, if you experience slowness accessing Office 365, it's probably something within your network and not the Office 365 environment itself. So there are a few things that I list out here that you can do. You can ensure that proxy and firewall devices are sized to handle the additional traffic. You want to make sure that your outbound proxies, if they require user authentication, you're going to get some slow connectivity or a loss of functionality. So you don't want to do that if possible. And you also want to make sure that you bypass any filtering on outbound connections. That'll help improve connectivity and performance. You can take it a little bit step further by trying to estimate your network bandwidth requirements. You can assess the number of users that you're going to have that are going to be accessing the internet through in Office 365, determine which services and features they're going to be using, and then there's a number of calculators and network tools to get a rough estimate for the bandwidth needs. And I should point out at this point that I do have in the notes of my PowerPoint, which I will give to Asif at the end of this presentation. I do have in my notes a number of links and technical documents and case studies that provide a little more detail than what I'm already providing here. So when I say that there are a number of calculators, I've got some links to the calculators that you can use to determine how to measure your network bandwidth. And then of course you'll want to measure your network utilization for a pilot group and try to extrapolate that to the entire organization. All right. So another important thing to think about is identity management. And this is actually often the starting point. Like once you've determined your tenant and set up your licensing and things like that, the next thing to do and determine your features, the next thing to do is to figure out how we're going to get our users' identities into Azure Active Directory and replicate it to there so that they can be surfaced in Office 365. And by identities, I mean they're not just their logins, but also their profile information and such. So this is where it gets a little bit technical after this slide, I believe. The first thing you want to do is make sure that your Active Directory information is accurate and up to date so that all the profile information is correct. A lot of people don't realize that Delve, for example, when you go to Delve, there's some profile information that shows the organization hierarchy. So when I click on a user, I can see who their manager is, and then I can click up and see who their manager is, and so on. Well, that only works if the manager attribute in Active Directory is filled out for all your users. So suddenly these things, when you move to Office 365 and those capabilities are front and center in Delve and turned on, that information suddenly becomes really relevant, and it's important that it's accurate. So you want to make sure that all that stuff is up to date. So I just mentioned that. So the way this works, and there are a number of different ways to get your cloud identity set up in Office 365. The first and easiest way is what's called the cloud identity. In other words, your user account is set up on Azure Active Directory, and it's used by Office 365 to sign in the user. So the Azure Active Directory stores your login name, your password, and all your profile information. And then when you try to sign into Office 365, it just calls Azure Active Directory, checks that you typed in the right password, and signs you in accordingly. The problem with this is that if you are working for your company, your password may not be the same for Office 365 as it is for your company password. And it might actually be a different login too. So it creates a little bit of an incongruence with that, and it's a little bit harder for users to manage. So most organizations do not opt for a cloud identity just because of the problems with inconsistent passwords and login information. The next way you can set this up is through what's called a synchronized identity. So you have an on-premises directory like Active Directory that stores all your user information, their login, their password, and their profile information and attributes. And you set up something called Azure Active Directory Connect. Azure Active Directory Connect synchronizes the user accounts and the passwords to Azure Active Directory so that when the user signs on to Office 365, they can sign on with the same login and the same password they use for their on-premises directory. There are a few drawbacks to this. A couple of the drawbacks are that the synchronization process is not instant. Another one is you can't always disable accounts instantaneously. So if you have some rogue emergency, employee who's deleting stuff and quit and stuff, you can't always get to that instantly, or it's a little bit more convoluted than just disabling the account in Active Directory. And there are a couple other things to think about with this process as well. With a federated identity, it's a little bit more interesting because in this case, just like in the previous one, the user account information and password is stored in your on-premises directory, but it's not actually replicated to Azure Active Directory except as just a backup. So when the user signs on to Office 365, Office 365 actually passes through the sign-on experience to the on-premises directory. And then the on-premises directory confirms that, yes, the sign-on was successful or not. And that's through something called Active Directory Federation Services, which is that little gear in the middle called ADFS. That ADFS can be sometimes a bear to set up and has a lot of infrastructure to go around it. So organizations don't necessarily love it, but it does provide a lot of nice features in that you're not actually putting your account information in the cloud, and you're not relying on that. You're just using the information directly in your on-premises directory. I do have noted on here, though, however, that we sync password hashes as a backup. So if for some reason the ADFS environment failed or the Office 365 couldn't reach the ADFS environment, users would still be able to log in after the admin performs a little failover technique because their passwords would be stored in Azure Active Directory as a backup. That's not necessary, obviously, but you can do that. But the last approach is by far the best. It's where the user signs on to Office 365 and the user account information, some basic account information is stored in Azure Active Directory. However, Azure Active Directory passes on the authentication to the on-premises directory. So it doesn't store any passwords or any information in Azure. It passes on the authentication to the on-premises directory. This is really nice because obviously there's no ADFS and significant infrastructure. It's really lightweight. You just install this agent on premises to do the authentication. It's secure, it's reliable, it's easy, and there's a number of other different benefits that go along with it. However, it's still in preview. So in the commercial tenants, it should not be implemented in production because it's still in preview, and there may be breaking changes before it goes to general availability. All right. I think some people have asked some questions, so just so you know, I will circle back and get to those. So last, we've got two sections left here, and one of the sections, the first section we'll cover is the considering additional tools. I think it's important to always think about how we can leverage additional tools to support a move to Office 365 or to support building business processes, things like that. So I've listed out a bunch of different tools that we can talk about. The first one you should consider is Microsoft Fast Track. Microsoft Fast Track is a program that provides best practices, tools, resources to help transition to the cloud. If you purchase more than 50 licenses, you can get 50 licenses. You can get onboarding and adoption assistance. However, if you get more than 150 licenses, they will actually help you move some of your data as well. So, but the program has changed a little bit. They used to help with SharePoint, and now they don't. Moving SharePoint data, and now they don't. But now they just help with email. So I'm not sure exactly. Like, it's constantly changing, but definitely that's something to consider as you're moving to Office 365 is getting the Microsoft help for planning and supporting that move. There's a whole bunch of other third-party tools for content migration. The three big ones are ShareGate, Metalogix, and AvePoint. There are others as well, BitTitan, I think I should mention as well. But they can help move email, SharePoint data, files, etc. to Office 365. Make it a little bit easier than if you just did it yourself or use the built-in Office 365 capabilities. For Active Directory and single sign-on, obviously there's ADFS, which I mentioned, but there are also a couple other single sign-on tools called OneLogin and Okta that can help with your single sign-on experience across a lot of different applications. So not just Office 365, but a bunch of different applications as well. So depending on your environment, if you want a single sign-on option that covers a lot of things besides just Office 365, you may start looking at like OneLogin or Okta or something like that. There's also Hyperfish. I mentioned earlier how important it is to clean up your Active Directory and make sure that it is in good shape before you migrate accounts to Office 365 so that you have good data out there. Hyperfish helps you do that. It actually analyzes your Active Directory, uses machine learning, sends out notifications to users. Please fill in your your first name or your middle initial, put your phone numbers missing, things like that. It helps get that information filled out. There's also inventory and maintenance. So SP Docket helps do some analysis of how your environment's set up, compares it to best practices and so on. So you can make adjustments as needed. And then, of course, Metalogix, ShareGate, and AvePoint do that as well. And then for business process and training, business process is important because a lot of organizations, as they move to Office 365, they are trying to figure out how to move their workflows, their custom applications that they've built on premises in their existing SharePoint environment. How do we get that to a working cloud environment without a ton of customization or rework? And that's where some tools like Nintex and K2 can come into play as well. And then for training, Asif could talk about this. The VisualSP product helps obviously the end users get some context-sensitive training in Office 365 virtually anywhere. So that's always an important part of any Office 365 implementation. Is even though you may be coming from an existing on-premises environment, things get rolled out and updated more quickly in Office 365, and users may not be familiar with the new look and feel or where things are located or how to get to it. All right, so lastly, you want to develop a roadmap. And this is extremely important because developing a roadmap, as I mentioned earlier, gets you from point A to point B, but not necessarily all at once. So you may, as I suggested, implement mail and then something else like files a month later into OneDrive, and then maybe you want to do SharePoint teams and groups after that. And maybe you want to roll them out to different people in the organization at different times. Maybe you want to do Skype for Business for one group in February and another group in March, just depending on their needs and how you want to communicate it and so So the roadmap helps you figure that all out. So this is just a very basic sample one. But along the top, you can see the timeline. So pre-migration, month one to three, and so on. And then along the left-hand side, you can see the different activities. So the foundation activities apply to the overall tenant. So you'll set up the tenant, validate the network infrastructure, implement identity management, etc. And then at some point you'll assign admin responsibilities, implement DLP, establish retention policies. And then step two is maybe you implement some initial training for the different departments right before they're about to be rolled out. And then email migration rollout would happen in this example to department one on month one and some of the other departments later. And then you roll out team sites, Skype for Business, and Teams later on accordingly. So all of this is just meant to say, think through how you want to roll this out. You do have the flexibility to roll out different pieces at different times and enable features at different times as well. All right, that was all I had. I thought there were some more questions, but there weren't. So, oh yeah, there is one. How do we restrict guest users from Microsoft Teams? Well, that is an excellent question. I believe, was it 2 days ago or 3 days ago? Microsoft rolled out the ability to add guest users to Teams. This is a new feature. It's probably it is the most requested feature for Teams is the ability to add guest users. And the functionality is a little bit convoluted because it doesn't exactly allow you to add anonymous users. You have to be authenticated, and there are some restrictions to it. But to be honest, I don't know. Like I haven't figured it out yet. Like it's that new. Like I haven't figured out how to restrict guest users from Teams yet. If I do come up with an answer, I'll let you know. Or if you want to email me, I'll track down an answer for you and get back to you. And then Tanya asked if this PowerPoint will be available in SlideShare. I am going to turn it over to Asif, and I believe he is going to make it available to people. I'm not sure how he was going to do that, but.
Yeah, actually, I'll go even beyond that. So Tanya's question is about the PowerPoint, but the PowerPoint as well as the recording will be making it available. And you guys will get a link to it, to both of them, in about 24 hours or less after the webinar.
There is one more question that I'll answer that just came in. What level of Office 365 is needed for synchronized Azure Active Directory? I think any level of an Office 365 tenant will allow you to synchronize your users to Azure Active Directory. I don't think there's a license restriction there. So, all right, thank you. I'll turn it over to Asif to wrap it up.
Yeah. Obviously, there's the questions that you've been seeing here, Doug, and the questions you guys have been asking. They're very much about, what's brand new, what's right now, what's going on. And as everybody knows, that Office 365 as a whole, including, of course, the Microsoft Teams, which is the hottest thing right now, is all a moving target. Things are changing too quickly. Having said that, the fundamentals of when to use what and what Doug has described as to what the things to be cognizant of when you're planning your migration, those fundamentals you want to have down very tight before you actually make the move or you strategize to make the move, because that could make or break the strategy for your organization going forward. I tell all of our clients, and I'm sure you'll agree as well, Doug, that you need to do what's best for you, not what's the hottest thing right now. So that might mean staying on-prem. That might mean completely going on the cloud. That might mean doing a hybrid. And regardless of where you are, depending on what you need, having the proper services turned on and then the other services turned off. As one of the attendees asked a question, right? How do you restrict guest users for Microsoft Teams? Now, obviously, if you ask some people, especially maybe some people from Microsoft, they'll say, well, why would you want to restrict people from guest users, right? They will want to keep it open. But in certain organizations, because of the regulations and other things that you have to abide by, you need to make that restriction, and that's your business use case. So that's much more important than any functionality, which is just, quote unquote cool to have. So I'm glad you guys are asking the right questions, going the right way. And Doug, I want to thank you for providing this webinar. This is been a lot of good information that you presented, and I'm sure everybody appreciated that.
Yeah, thank
Uh,
you, Asif.
Absolutely. Thank you.